At this moment, Belgorod is on the brink. The Ukrainian armed forces have captured a new settlement there. Panic in the Kremlin. The enemy's headquarters was blown to pieces. Russia's losses will shock you. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian armed forces created chaos at the Kavkazskaya oil depot. Sensation. The EU is preparing a peacekeeper for Ukraine, but British troops refuse to go. All of this and more in our broadcast. Hotspot. Russia has indeed become smaller in the Pokrovske direction. Ukrainian fighters managed to break the occupiers' assault and stop them near Pokrovsk. What is happening in the Kursk region at this time? It's loud, there again. And that's not all. The Ukrainian armed forces continue to advance and consolidate in the Belgorod region. How do Ukrainian defenders manage to press the enemy so powerfully? Watch the latest news from the front in the report.
The Ukrainian armed forces repelled the attack on Pokrovsk and launched an offensive in the Belgorod region. Meanwhile, Russia's attempts to storm the south of Ukraine have not been successful. What is the situation on the front today, and what lies is the Kremlin telling while reporting on its successes? The information that the Ukrainian armed forces launched an offensive in the Belgorod region caused quite a stir recently. At that time, it was about the battles for the village of Demidovka. But by the end of the week, the area under Ukrainian control expanded by 2 more settlements. According to Z military correspondents, the Ukrainian troop group decided to stretch along the border, creating a kind of buffer zone. Additionally, analysts consider another task of the Belgorod operation to be the attempt to draw part of the Russian troops there, which are currently attacking in the Kursk region. Officially, the Russian military leadership has acknowledged that the Ukrainians have once again breached their border. However, in its characteristic manner, it stated that there are no more than 50 saboteurs. At the same time, they are allegedly suffering heavy losses, simultaneously losing tanks, BMPs, and other equipment.
According to the Russian military command, several long-range howitzers of American manufacture. This causes the greatest objection and amazement because taking long-range artillery with you to attack enemy territory, you really have to think of that. I think that no one has done this. So these reports are naturally typical for the Russian military leadership. These are fake reports where the enemy's losses are simply fabricated, having no relation to the real situation.
Another Russian fake that is actively spreading online. Russia is preparing to occupy the largest cities in the north and south of Ukraine. Recently, President Zelensky did indeed say that these regions should be ready to repel attacks. But occupation? Here, Kremlin propaganda has clearly overdone it. There, Mom is preparing for any search.
We must be ready for the development of any kind of events. But to say that these actions will lead to the occupation of Kharkiv, Sumy, or Zaporizhzhia would be a significant exaggeration.
Well, I will know because of the previous.
The enemy does not have the strength to capture Kharkiv, Sumy, Zaporizhzhia.
But then why is Russia preparing a possible offensive in new directions? According to analysts, we have been observing something similar since the first day of the war, where the main strike occurs in one place, and the other assaults serve to distract attention and tie up the reserves of the armed forces of Ukraine. Strategically for...
The Donetsk direction remains strategic for the enemy, but again, based on the patterns of Russian military science, an offensive on this section of the front involves secondary offensive actions or a diversionary offensive, which today could include actions in the Sumy, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhzhia regions.
And on the main direction of the attack, considering the enemy's efforts and losses, it can be said that there are no results. Paying daily with hundreds of lives, mobilized for mere tens of meters of advancement, the Kremlin still has not been able to achieve its main goal since last year of capturing Pokrovske. 2 weeks ago, they were stopped by the US-1 10th.
I think it was the 1st Brigade that stopped them, disrupted their logistics during the assault, and drove them from their positions. Then the 25th Airborne Unit completely dismantled them. Those who could fled and liberated the settlement. Then there were 5 or 6 episodes already in the Pokrovsk direction when the enemy even driven from their positions when our forces advanced forward. This is not yet a full counteroffensive, it's just the situation on the battlefield, but it already shows that they are overstrained there and they lack strength.
Against this backdrop, analysts believe that a breakthrough by the Russians in other sections of the front should not be expected. Everyone now understands that the occupation of the Donetsk region is task number one for Putin. Therefore, the Kremlin will definitely not deploy prepared units to the south or north of Ukraine.
To what extent does the enemy have the resources that would allow them to conduct active operations on multiple sections of the front? Simultaneously, there is only one conclusion. The enemy does not have such resources. As of today, I'll say more. At the peak of their activity, we observed the number of the enemy, and this was mentioned by General Budanov and the President of Ukraine. The number of the enemy was up to 650,000. Today, we are saying that approximately 610,000 are operating on the fronts. So approximately 3 divisions have disappeared.
To be fair, it should be said that the Russians do have some successes. By gathering everything possible and reinforcing their troops with North Koreans, they still managed to push the Ukrainian armed forces from their positions in the Kursk region. However, our military continues to carry out their tasks there to this day, holding a bridgehead of about 100 square kilometers and repeatedly thwarting all attempts by Russia to encircle them.
Right now, Belgorod is preparing to meet the Ukrainian armed forces. Ukrainian fighters made a powerful breakthrough there and took control of a new settlement. But that's not all. Not only on the ground, but also from the air, the Ukrainian armed forces are terrorizing the enemy. In the Kursk region, the occupiers' headquarters was blown to pieces after a precise strike. The losses for Russia are shocking. Watch the report for all the details.
This is how the fighters of one of the fire units of the Guard Brigade operate. Using a multiple launch rocket system, they destroy personnel, equipment, shelters, fuel and ammunition depots of the Russians in the Volchansk direction.
We had one of such targets. It was necessary to destroy 10 Russian shelters, and with 12 shots. We destroyed all 10 shelters, but you can't do such work for long because an FPV drone might come, or even something much bigger than an FPV. So every outing is a risk.
Since the beginning of the day, there have already been 105 battles on the front line. Most of the Russian assaults are in the Pokrovsk direction, as noted by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
The Pokrovsk direction was key. They were actively pushing there. A month ago, they were stopped. The 110th repelled the assault, disrupted their logistics, drove them from their positions, and advanced forward. In Kotlino, they tried to cut off an important road to Pokrovsk. The 25th Airborne Brigade went in there and dismantled them into pieces, the remaining ones. They retreated. However, many of them were left. Kotlino was liberated. Everything is excellent. We are defending 45 or even 6 positions around Pokrovsk. The occupiers have already been pushed back from Pokrovsk. It's hot again, but it was never quiet there. No, Russia no longer has serious resources. They are relying on reinforcements from North Koreans. They have been purchasing shells from North Korea for a long time, and now self-propelled artillery systems in the Lyman area.
Ukrainian troops successfully repelled Russian assaults in the areas of Yampolivka and Novomikhailivka in the Donetsk region. The enemy attempted to advance in the areas of Kapanok, Zarizovi and Kamenka in the Kharkiv region. In the Donetsk direction, Ukrainian defenders disabled another North Korean long-range artillery system, Koksan.
In the last month, this is already the 5th such installation disabled by the units of the drone systems forces. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine's defense forces have destroyed more than 25,000 Russian artillery systems. Therefore, due to the shortage of barrel artillery, the Russian army is increasingly using Koksans received from North Korea. From the message of the command of the UAV forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on Facebook.
The Russians themselves also note an unprecedented level of personnel losses, experts say.
There is objective control data indicating that the Russian side is throwing into battle, even those who have not fully undergone medical recovery. Russian army soldiers. These are either the so-called special contingent or forcibly mobilized residents of the occupied regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. There is confirmation from the Russian side of itself that people are being removed. The armed forces of Ukraine in the Maliknaya war are launching assaults on Ukrainian positions.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
A new successful operation by the Ukrainian army. Russian propagandists are forced to acknowledge the capture by Ukrainian forces of the village of Demidovka in the Belgorod region. In addition, the armed forces of Ukraine are also assaulting the settlement of Popovka and are already in the village. Z1 Corps note that Ukrainians are advancing in the Belgorod region. According to the German publication Bild, the armed forces of Ukraine continue to advance on 3 more villages in the 10-kilometer border zone.
Moreover, according to reports from the Russian side, the Ukrainian defense forces struck the logistical component of a bridge, which creates serious logistical problems for the concentrated Russian troops in this area. In other words, it is essentially a threat of operational encirclement.
The press service of the USSR reports that our troops have destroyed 2 enemy Ka-52 helicopters and 2 more Mi-8 helicopters. In addition to actions on the ground, there are active operations in the air. The General Staff reports a strike by the armed forces of Ukraine on the headquarters of the occupiers in the Kursk region, resulting in the elimination of about 30 occupiers. Ukraine noted that the destruction of this element of the Russian military infrastructure reduces the occupiers' ability to conduct combat operations in the Sumy and Kursk regions. Ukrainians are also actively operating in the Donbass, managing to eliminate not only the enemy army but also Putin's propagandists.
According to the Russian side, it was a so-called double strike, using a multiple launch rocket system, HIMARS. Moreover, the Russian side was forced to acknowledge the colossal number of losses among the personnel of the Russian army. In addition to the Russian army personnel, as a result of the Ukrainian Defense Forces strike on permanent deployment points, there were casualties. The operator of the Zvezda TV channel, Andrei Panov, and thank you, the driver of the film crew, Alexander Sarkeli. Furthermore, it is reported that as a result of the strike on the permanent deployment points of the occupying army in Mikhailovka, Zvezda correspondent Nikita Goldin was seriously injured.
As the Ukrainian side has repeatedly stated, we strike exclusively at military targets on the territory of the Russian Federation. However, and this is no longer even hidden by the Russians, the civilian population often suffers. And all because the occupiers themselves direct the drone towards their own citizens instead of strategic targets.
Drones are linked to GPS. When they enter the range of electronic warfare, their course is disrupted. They head anywhere but towards the target. Therefore, very often they end up in residential areas, crashing into hospitals, schools, and so on. Yes, the military does not shy away from hitting social facilities, but it makes no sense for them to have a drone fly 100 kilometers to hit a hospital. That's not their target. I repeat, the enemy drone entered the range of our electronic warfare. It lost orientation and it falls wherever it happens to be.
Considering the shortage of air defense systems, they are trying to cover exclusively strategic objects, and it should be noted that the assistance, and now Putin's residence is in Valdai or in Sochi.
Let's talk about the war that is literally crossing borders. In Kazakhstan, a drone with the inscription Garen fell. And these drones, as is known, are used by Russia for attacks against Ukraine. Since February, there have already been 3 such stray drones.
The Russian Federation has repeatedly made official statements about territorial claims on the northern regions of Kazakhstan. Moreover, I do not rule out that this is an opportunity for military political pressure on Kazakhstan to increase the extraction of Kazakh oil and gas.
Against the backdrop of the fuel crisis in the Russian Federation related to successful attacks by Ukrainian UAVs on oil refineries, it is quite possible that this incident is nothing more than another provocation by the racists to disrupt negotiations where they failed to pressure Ukraine's partners to withdraw troops from the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, as well as from Donbass.
Exclusive. Russian occupiers shelled their own Sudra gas metering station. And of course, they blamed Ukraine for it. A signature Kremlin move. Also during the week, drones now from the armed forces of Ukraine struck hard at the oil depot. Caucasian. The Russians were putting out the fire there all week. Why was this particular strike so painful for Russia? More on this later.
A new provocation from the Russians. Putin's occupation forces shelled the Sudra gas metering station in the Kursk region and blamed Ukraine for it.
According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, this station has been repeatedly shelled by the Russians themselves. In particular, last summer it was bombarded with guided aerial bombs, and 3 days ago the Russians hit it again with Kaabis.
In fact, the Russian Federation is undermining these agreements. And by striking the Sudza gas distribution station, it is attempting to discredit Ukraine's defense forces to supposedly show the Ukrainian side's inability to negotiate, and furthermore, the violation of previously reached agreements. In other words, the possibility of even concluding 30-day a ceasefire, and accordingly further moving towards so-called peace agreements to end the war in Ukraine. All of this indicates that it is a planned nature of the Russian provocation.
Meanwhile, in Kuban, the oil depot continues to blaze. Caucasian. The Kavkazskaya oil depot was attacked by drones on the night of March 19th. The facility has halted its operations because the drones disabled the pipeline between the tanks. But the refinery continues to burn for the second day.
The entire plant is completely on fire. Uncontrolled burning has already started. There isn't a single fire truck on the premises. In short, everyone has evacuated from there. All the hoses have burned, everything that was there.
According to Russian media, during the firefighting process, an explosion of petroleum products occurred due to the depressurization of a burning tank and the release of burning oil.
What is happening today is the explosion of one of the tanks and the increase of the fire area to 10,000 square meters. In other words, the Russian Federation is forced to acknowledge serious problems at the moment, and the consequences of Ukrainian strikes using UAVs with the capability to transport petroleum products. This oil depot was used as a transit point, and accordingly, the inability of the local central authority to counter external threats in the form of drone strikes and to promptly eliminate the consequences.
And while Russia is ablaze, Putin's main security aide, Sergei Shoigu, has arrived in North Korea. Upon arrival, the Russian Federation's passport control worked with comrade Sergei Shoigu. Shoigu is scheduled to meet with Kim Jong-un and other DPRK officials. The North Korean dictator has become a key ally of Putin in the war in Ukraine.
Apparently, Shoigu's visit is related to the further nature of arms supplies. The DPRK's production is directly for the needs of the country's army. Occupant, primarily it concerns Saukaksan drones manufactured by North Korea. And most importantly, it's the personnel of the DPRK military plus artillery shells for the needs of the occupant's army.
And in the skies over Ukraine, British Typhoon or F-35 fighters may appear. The United Kingdom may take a leading role in providing air cover for the troops. In the coming weeks, the planes will be sent to Poland, but they may later be transferred to Ukraine, reports The Telegraph.
In principle, the British Typhoon corresponds in its class to either the Russian Su-35 or the American F-16E. If there is a positive decision regarding the transfer or the coverage of airspace, what about the British Typhoons? This will significantly enhance the capabilities of the Ukrainian side, especially in terms of air defense. And the Typhoons will be used to destroy enemy radar, electronic warfare, and high dynamic targets. But most importantly, that they will be used to strike command and control centers, temporary deployment points, and heavy armored vehicle accumulation points.
Dozens of countries have offered to provide troops, aircraft, ships, and other resources for a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. All in order to end the bloody war initiated by Putin.